up, everybody? My name is Ace, and you're listening to my stupid, lovely brain. I'm gonna tell you some stories. This is gonna be fucking therapeutic. When you're the parent of a toddler and a newborn, you're actually not allowed to go on vacation. Just like you should get a sitter if you want to go to the cinema. At least for a few years. Well, let me tell you about my young family's trip to Hawaii, all the way back in 2006. I mentioned it in the last episode, and I'd like to start out by clarifying something. I said that I took my family on vacation. I actually had nothing to do with it other than money coming out of my wife and I's joint bank account. I don't even remember whose idea it was to go to Honolulu as a group. It could have been Sheila's, my former mother-in-law's. She was the one who handled all the travel arrangements, and if you're listening, Sheila, by chance, I'm sorry if I came across as ungrateful for the trip. Our group of weary travelers consisted of myself, my wife, our two kids, Zelda and Cambria, ages 3 years and around 3 months respectively at the time, my brother-in-law, my sister-in-law and her husband and their 2 kids, Sheila, my mother-in-law, and her grandparents. I was definitely the odd one out in this group, and we all knew it. I was hoping this trip would let me finally relax about my pending cases and the paving business back on the mainland, and we could all maybe start to get along. Or at least let them see that I'm not always such a stressed out jerk. Yeah, I should really stop making plans. The vacation started out a fucking train wreck because I couldn't find a lighter at the Honolulu airport. When we were leaving Las Vegas, I was told that I couldn't bring any combustibles onto a plane. So I was ill prepared when it came time to re-upping my nicotine levels once we got to the island. I stormed around the airport, making the rounds of all the gift shops. And I was having shit for luck. I mean, none of these places even had a book of matches available. I was starting to think that smoking was banned at the airport. I was also apparently scaring the other travelers with my behavior. So, of course, security caught up with me, asked me what the problem was, and diffused the situation by hooking me up with a lighter. Over the course of a cigarette, the 2 security guards kind of put things into perspective for me. They taught me the true meaning of aloha, and what a haole was, and how my demeanor was more haole than aloha. And I don't know why it took 2 strangers thousands of miles away from home telling me I was being an asshole to finally see that I should probably make some changes. Honestly, looking back, those 2 guards are probably the catalyst that kickstarted the self-discovery journey that I've been on for the past 15 years or so. Anyway, my wife and family were back at Avis with everyone else, and she was being a glowing example of how you should act in public when you are having a nicotine withdrawal. I still, to this day, don't know how she did it. Everyone scolded me for my behavior. I apologized. And with that, we were on our way to Waikiki to spend 11 days at a beach resort. The affordable one. Chill. The drive to the hotel from the airport was crazy beautiful. I couldn't help but stare in awe at the mountains as we sped down the H1. Sheila was driving, and I was sitting in the back with the kids, just taking it all in. Feeling like a fool for earlier, but ready to start again once we all got settled at the hotel. That night, everything was fine. We relaxed a bit, and then ventured out on foot to forage for dinner. My family didn't get far because there was a Wolfgang Puck Express in our hotel's lobby. See? Totally affordable. After pizza, we walked the boardwalk, got ice cream from Cold Stone, and watched the sunset from a pier. It was perfect. The plan seemed to be coming together, and I already started to forget about being nearly arrested that morning. Day 2 was packed full of fun on the itinerary. We met up in the lobby and traveled to the other side of the island to link up with an adventure company for a few hours on the water. The place was nestled into a shopping village on the east side, and it was so small that the lobby could hardly fit our robust group. After the instructional videos were watched and waivers signed, we chose our activities for the day, broke off into our separate groups, and headed out. My wife and I chose scuba diving and parasailing. Scuba was up first. We were taxied out to the dive boat on a little canoe with an outboard motor. Once aboard, we were greeted by the crew with a glass of fresh pineapple juice, and once everyone was on board, we were assigned wetsuits and our gear. The captain gave us a quick rundown on descending without bursting our capillaries. Then his crew began taking us down in groups of 4. We were provided snorkeling gear to keep us occupied while we waited. For some reason, snorkeling gave me a panic attack, so I made my way back to the boat and waited above the surface, wondering if I could go through with the day's activities. When my wife joined me back on board, she asked if I was okay, and I lied and said, yeah, just didn't want to waste my energy before the dive, you know. And within 20 minutes, we were putting on our weights and tanks and hopping into the water. On the way down, I was kind of terrified, not gonna lie to you. My anxiety was at an all-time high, and I couldn't even open my eyes at first. Once I could, though, the world changed. I was holding my breath as I took in this new environment. I had to remind myself to breathe through the regulator. Watching all of the underwater life was something I never thought I would see with my own eyes. I'm from the landlocked desert, and at that time in my life, I couldn't see past the next week. And week in, week out, all I did was work. But being down there, I forgot about all that was back on the mainland. I looked over at my wife, whose hair had never seemed more red and vibrant as it did below the surface of the water, as clear as glass, with the blue sky as a backdrop, and I wondered if she felt as free and as calm as I did in that moment. And then I finally took a deep breath. I knew the dives didn't last very long, though, and I thought it was my only chance, so I shot every exposure of my disposable underwater Kodiak in what felt like only a minute. Back on the dive boat, all of us tourists were excitingly exchanging our experiences down there, and I wanted to go again. I didn't want to parasail. I wanted to get back below the surface rather than fly above it, so I asked if it was possible to stay on the dive boat instead of going back to the dock. Again, breaking the itinerary and frustrating a few people in the group, but the dive master was cool as fuck, and he said that we could even make it our official second dive, and once we got back to the mainland, we could dive in a lake somewhere with an instructor to get certified. I was pumped. Hell yeah, a second dive. Too bad I was out of film. The second dive was crazy. Sea turtles were everywhere. That's where I learned the hard way that touching them was illegal. And we swam on with them for what felt like forever, lost in this new world. I looked over at one point and saw that a taco squid had attached itself to one of the instructor's heads, and me without my disposable underwater Kodiak from Kmart. Damn. Back on the boat, we changed and checked our gear back into the captain, thanked him and his crew for the aloha, and took the little canoe taxi back to the docks to meet up with the rest of our group. Dinner that night went off without any problems, other than myself and Ross fighting over the tab. It was harmless fun, and it gave us all a few laughs. At that point in the trip, everyone's biggest problem was that I took smoke breaks, even though my wife was right there with me most of the time, which felt kind of contradictory to me and was making me feel left out. I brushed it off as if it was nothing new, because it wasn't. It didn't piss me off until the day we spent at the Polynesian Cultural Center on the North Shore. Run by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the PCC sits right next to BYU Oahu. Now, I forgot to mention that everyone in the group other than myself and my 2 kids were raised in the Mormon Church. Of course, we are from Utah after all. The day was going great at first. We were making all of the stops on the tour of the center, and we were learning about Hawaiian history. The Mormon version, anyway. And around noon, we watched a parade on the river with floats representing all of the different cultures of the islands. At one of the stops for the kids, we all got stamped with traditional tattoos. I opted for the face tattoo, of course. I was getting shots of everything with our little digital camera, and it seemed like we were all having a blast. Then I noticed a sign that directed me to a smoking area. I pointed it out to my wife and she said, "You go ahead, I'll stay with the kids." Now I figured she meant we would smoke in shifts, so I ran, following my nose to the section and sucked down a cigarette with the rest of the degenerates. I then beat the path back to meet up with everyone, and when I finally found them, ugh. Well, first of all, they were mad because I had missed the family photo. So check this out. There were employees walking around dressed in Hawaiian garb with expensive cameras selling photos to the tourists, and we were turning them down all day. Suddenly, though, they decided that they wanted to get a family shot while I was smoking. Plenty of opportunities to do that while I was around, but nah, they did it in the 10-minute time frame that I was away, doing a devilish deed with a nail meant for a coffin. It was clear these people did not want me as a part of their family, and that was fine with me. In their eyes, I was rude, and in mine, they were. Later that evening, there was a luau, and the night was capped with a fire dance performance. I would have loved all of that had I not started to feel completely alienated. We weren't coming together as an extended family, and I just felt like I was tagging along and ruining a great experience for my wife. I got a great shot of the sunset as we headed to the parking lot to leave, though, so there's that. On the long drive back from the North Shore to Waikiki, I made them stop at a store so I could grab smokes, and I ended up talking story with the clerk and a local that was there killing time. It was as simple as where you from, what you doing on the North Shore, catching the surf kind of thing. And those 5 minutes were so far the best part of the day for me at that point, and it was 8 o'clock. Hawaii was starting to put a really bad taste in my mouth, and it tasted like Wolfgang Puck Express pizza, seawater, and 30 SPF. 5 days in, my wife, my kids, and I are walking down Ala Moana checking out all the shops, and I couldn't help but feel we could have just driven to Malibu, had a better experience, and saved thousands of dollars. When suddenly a street performer stopped us for a show with his birds. It was a pleasant surprise, and I was honestly finally having fun. I fucking love animals, and when my 3-year-old showed no sign of fear with a blue and yellow macaw on their shoulder, checking their hair for treats, I found myself smiling from ear to ear as I snapped away, getting a couple of good shots. We tipped the man for the show and the photos, and we were on our way. A few minutes after the bird show, a guy walking down the street casually asked me if I had tried that Maui Wowie yet. Ugh, finally. The vacation was starting to turn around for me. Maybe my problem was that I couldn't bring my medicine, so I was waiting to accidentally find some cannabis out there. It was basically a 2-week vacation without it, and at this point, I was desperate. So we ducked into the bathroom of a hotel on the strip, and he sold me a quarter of what looked like some damn fine Hawaiian-grown buds. I gave him $100, told him mahalo, and we went our separate ways. I met back up with Jen and the kids, and we started looking for a spot to hit for dinner. Back at our hotel, we asked Sheila if she can watch the kids for us for a minute so we can roll a joint and hit the alley behind the resort. She agreed, and after we left her room, we ducked back into ours so I could roll one. I noticed the buds looked a little different out here, and they didn't have a very strong odor, and it was pretty hard to break up. I was starting to think I'd been ripped off. We only hit the alley and tried to smoke it in a last-ditch effort to save face. It was fake bud. So now I was in trouble for wasting $100 too. Now I don't want to say I didn't have any fun on that vacation, but damn if it wasn't difficult. On our off days, my wife and I would choose to just cruise around and check out the island. We spent a lot of time at the beach, where I met some local surfers that smoked me out, which was a welcome relief from the vacation. What's funny is that even when we knew we would be at the beach all day, I was still shot down when I brought up surfing lessons. I'll never figure that one out. Anyway, the rest of our time there was just a blur of more of the same shit. I felt like I should have just stayed home and paved parking lots. For our final day, we had planned on breakfast as a family. We decided we'd just go where our hearts told us and choose the restaurant in the morning. No reservations, nothing fancy. Those were the only rules for breakfast. So of course, the entire time we were there, I was keeping my eye out for local places that served breakfast. There were a few within what I consider walking distance of the hotel, and I looked those 3 up online and checked out some menus. After about 20 minutes of waiting for the resort's very expensive and very slow connection, I'd found the place I wanted to recommend. I forget the name now, but I remember they boasted about their Loco Mocos online, and I was down to grind before the dreaded flight back to the mainland. So we all met up in the lobby, and I figured we would all have different recommendations and then argue for a bit before coming to a vote. Nope. I guess everyone but me had already talked it over, and they had decided that IHOP was where we would have our last breakfast in Waikiki. Fucking IHOP. I was a little more than perturbed, but I kept a cool head and tried to calmly argue my case. I said if they wanted IHOP so badly, we could go there tomorrow for breakfast at the one in St. George, where we all live. Well, of course they weren't fucking having any of that, and I caved. We took the bus to the restaurant, and because everyone was upset with me again, they didn't think my dad jokes about the bus on Oahu being named The Bus were very funny. So we get to IHOP, and we get through the process of them being taken by surprise by such a large party, and having to rearrange the dining room for us. Seriously, all of us on the patio at the place I had in mind, at our own tables, would have been fine, and no one would have had to change a thing, but the fuck do I know about vacationing in Hawaii, right? Finally seated with our menus is when our 3-year-old decides, fuck it, I'm gonna throw a fit over a green crayon. Oh man, I was so done. I tried to console the kiddo, but they weren't having it and started to throw things from the table to the ground. I kind of felt like doing the same thing, so I told my wife that we would walk back to the hotel, just the 2 of us. We'd grab something to eat on the way, and we'd calm down and see you back at the resort. Now, of course, this was my idea, so it pissed my wife and mother-in-law off so badly that they got in on the temper tantrum and started coming at me. Until I finally just picked up my kid, their diaper bag, and as calmly as possible walked out of the restaurant back to the hotel. We walked along Ala Moana for about a block, then turned right onto Kalakaua Avenue and retraced the bus route in reverse. Zelda on my hip, still crying but starting to calm down. After a few blocks down the avenue, we were both finally calm, people watching as we walked. I was doing my best to teach my 3-year-old why we don't throw things around when we don't get our way, which wasn't easy, especially when you struggle with your own anger management. I hopefully did a better job later on in life. I let them hold my hand and walk as I looked for somewhere we could get something to eat. By this point, we were both pretty hungry, so we settled for a place I can't remember and consumed some questionable culinary breakfast experiments on a park bench. Back on the sidewalk, I was feeling the weight of my bad breakfast decisions when suddenly my right arm jerked backwards. I stopped. I looked back and I saw that Zelda was standing there looking down. There was a lot of foot traffic that morning, as I'm sure there is every morning in a bustling little beach city such as Waikiki. They hardly noticed us though, just drifted around us. The tourists doing tourist things, the locals heading to work, or home from work, or maybe to the beach. Now I thought Zelda was upset again, so I asked, what was the matter? And they didn't respond, just kept looking down. I said, hey kiddo, we gotta go, we're in the way. They looked up at me and pointed at the sidewalk and said, look. I finally looked down to see what had caught their attention. It was a single chamomile flower growing through a crack in the cement. I said, oh cool. Now, okay, let's go. And they yelled, no, and pulled their hand away from mine. Not wanting to get that started again, I said, okay, we can stay here for a minute, but you gotta hold my hand and let's move back a little to get out of the way. So we stepped back a few feet and sat down. And we looked at the flower. and the city continued on around us. After about a minute of looking, I remembered that our camera was in the diaper bag, so I figured I'd get a shot of the flower so I can show him and say, now we can look at it forever. So I grabbed the camera out and then leaned forward and tried to focus, but I was too far away. So I leaned in some more until there I was, on my knees and elbows trying to balance in the middle of a busy sidewalk as I focused the little Sony Cybershot. I got a couple shots and quickly sat back down next to Zell. I was showing him the shots on the camera's little LCD, and I was actually kind of blown away by the results. It was by far the best picture, quality-wise, that I had taken the entire trip. We looked at the photos for a second, and I said, okay, let's get going. And since they were satisfied, off we went. It was only a few blocks left until we could rest and wait for everyone to get back from IHOP. When they got back, all hell broke loose. After we left IHOP, instead of moving on, the topic over breakfast was how I was a terrible father and a criminal, and they were all dying to tell me about it when they got back. I was met with some of the most irrational anger and vitriol I'd witnessed in a long time, and that's coming from me. So of course, I finally lost my shit. I yelled at them that they could all get fucked and they had no idea what they were talking about, to the point my mother-in-law and I were in each other's faces, screaming over one another, until we both walked away before one of us started swinging. We were all coming in and out of each other's rooms to yell at each other while we packed and tried to beat the checkout clock, and all could be heard in the hallways of what now is named the Aston Waikiki Beach Hotel. With no resolution to be had, we all finished our checkout routine and met in the open-air lobby. There were about 8 hours between us and takeoff. Great. Our last day in paradise started off like dynamite and gasoline in a blender near an open flame, and of course, it was my fault. However, by this point, everyone had had time to breathe and relax. Sticking to the itinerary, we put all of our luggage into the rentals and had the valets bring the cars back to the garage so we could walk over to the Honolulu Zoo. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of zoos, but I knew I was already on pretty thin ice with these people, so I took it as an opportunity to learn and even teach my kids what I knew about some of the animals there. And even though the tiger enclosure was just a chain link fence that any patron could just walk up to and stick their hand through, and an icy cost $8, what happened at the Maui airport later that evening is what finally gave me the biggest panic attack of the entire trip. You see, we planned this trip before I was arrested, arraigned, and then bailed out. None of us thought I'd be able to go once I was fighting serious charges, so my mother-in-law went to the travel agent and asked him to put my ticket on hold until we knew for sure. It took a long time to get approval from the different agencies and districts involved in my cases, but I got it done and was approved to leave the mainland. Something happened when we let the travel agent know that I could go, something none of us knew until we were checking in at our connecting flight back to Las Vegas. It turned out that my ticket home was on a different flight than everyone else's, and I had an instant panic attack because I had never traveled alone other than driving all over Utah for work, and my kids weren't going to be right there with me. My wife was freaking out because she didn't want to have to deal with 2 babies on a 6-hour red-eye, and who could blame her, which just added to my anxiety. Again, everyone went into an uproar, and my single panic attack turned into a breakdown of nerves. We were all so emotionally charged that when I had to rush to my gate, it was like we were never going to see each other again. But we did. Shortly after I boarded the plane, sat in the midst of a high school volleyball team headed to Las Vegas for a tournament, I was next to the coach, and as I told him the Cliff's Notes version of our trip, I heard a commotion coming from behind us. I looked back and it was my family. They somehow all got onto the same flight as me, and honestly, when I saw them, all the anger and frustration and resentment from the whole trip had melted away. The coach saw our emotional reunion and had his team move seats so we could all sit together, truly showing us some aloha. We got everyone settled in just as we were about to taxi to the runway. Hand in hand, my wife and I breathed a sigh of relief as the plane sped up and took off. What a trip. Before we left Utah, I was elected to drive half of us home from Las Vegas, a 2-hour drive tacked on to the back end of a 6.5-hour flight. So I was allowed to sleep that night on an empty row of seats that I found, as much as I could anyway. The drive home was a relaxing and beautiful feature-length trip through the American desert. My wife, kids, Sheila, and my brother-in-law all slept in the back of the van, so I kept the radio off and enjoyed the silence for 2 hours. After dropping off our passengers in St. George, we got back on the freeway, and in my peripheral vision I saw a familiar sign in the distance. I looked over to my wife, who was now wide awake in the passenger seat, and cracked a smile as we passed our local IHOP. This episode was brought to you by a random package. The beats heard in My Stupid Lovely Brain are produced by Righteous Foot. Check them out on SoundCloud. I might need